Now, while Democrats and Republicans dominate U.S. political headlines, scores of smaller parties dot America's landscape and at times have a major impact on national, state and local elections by capitalizing on disaffection with the major parties. Some of these parties echo America's past, like the Prohibition Party, founded in 1869, which has long opposed consuming alcohol. America's main minor leftist parties include the Socialist Party USA, founded in the 1970s, and more recently, the American Solidarity Party, a Christian democratic party influenced by Christian social teaching, which was founded in 2011. And then there's the Working Families Party, which says that state by state and community by community, it's building a multiracial party of working people to transform America and eliminate things like bigotry.
Hi, I'm Maurice Mitchell from the Working Families Party. Together, we're building a multiracial movement of working people to transform America. Here's how we see it. No matter what you look like or where you're from, most of us want the same things. We want to earn enough to thrive, not just survive, and leave a better future for our kids. We want healthy food and clean water, safe neighborhoods and a safe world. We want to contribute something bigger than ourselves. We want to be free. But the richest people on earth and the political insiders who serve them have rigged the rules to grab up wealth and power for themselves. And they point the finger to blame people of color or immigrants or poor people. Also, we don't stand united and see what we have in common. The Working Families Party is regular people coming together to make our nation work for the many, not the few. Now, if you're smart, you're probably thinking, but how? You're thinking it sounds impossible. You're thinking no one could build a new party in a two-party system. But a party is just a group of people who share a vision of a better world and work together to make change.
Well, for more on the smaller parties in America and why they're important, I'm joined now by the man you saw in that video. He's on the line from New York, Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. First of all, just tell us a little bit about the Working Families Party and what it actually stands for.
Well, the Working Families Party is a national political movement for the many, not the few, right? And what we believe is that working people deserve our own political movements that are independent of the interest of the landlords and big oil and pharmaceutical companies and corporations. And currently in the very rigid two-party system in the United States, it's very, very hard for working people and everyday people to be able to manifest our own political party, our own political power. And so the Working Families Party is designed to do just that. And what we do is we recruit everyday people, people like teachers and labor organizers and parents and activists to run on the local level, on the state level, and on the federal level. Because we believe that people who have the actual experience of having to figure out how to make ends meet, having to figure out how to pay for childcare or healthcare, having to deal with police violence, those folks are the best people to figure out what policies might look like. Because working people are dealing with the challenges, with the contradictions, with the downside of the system in a way that is lived, in a way that isn't academic or removed. And so we're better positioned to make policy for everybody. And we're also accountable because we're in our communities every day. We're accountable to our families, to our communities in ways that people who are removed simply aren't. What they tend to be is they're more accountable to lobbyists or to corporations, people who fill their campaign coffers with plenty of money. And so we're trying to form an intervention that is grassroots, that is simple and easy to understand for every single working person, to try to challenge this idea that politics are for some other people or people of privilege. Politics is ultimately about the demos, the people. And so we want to make politics not so much fitting inside the confines of the left to right, Democrat, Republican sort of dichotomy, but we're more focused on the politics of the bottom rising up.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting analysis and an introduction to your party. And the Working Families Party, I understand, has active chapters in just over 20 states. I mean, does that make you a minor political party in America or sort of medium range party?
We're small but mighty. So we have a presence in 20 states in terms of having paid staff people who are building the party in those states. But we have activists in every single state, and the party cycle after cycle we endorse close to 1,000 candidates, and then we really put our muscle behind dozens and dozens of candidates on the local level and on the state level. And we have many examples this cycle and cycles before of independent Working Families Party candidates ultimately winning and defeating entrenched candidates from the traditional sort of pathways. So Jamal Bowman, for example, is somebody that we endorsed and is a Working Families Democrat who's in Congress now, who previous to his experience in politics was an educator who was dedicated to his community in the Bronx. And because of his role as an educator, he saw through the families and the children in his school all of the challenges that working families face every day, and he wanted to do something about it in the halls of Congress, and now he's in Congress. Or Kendra Brooks, a activist and a mother in Philly who's from North Philly, Nicetown, and has been on the streets day after day after day advocating for housing rights and police justice, and now sits as an independent Working Families Party at large city council person in Philadelphia. And there's countless others. Candy Sedabaka, who's on this Denver City Council, who's a Working Families Party Democrat. We often hack the Democratic Party's system by recruiting our people to challenge Democrats in the Democratic Party primary. That's one of the ways that we look at the system as it is. We find ways of hacking the system as it is in order to get independent people through the system. At the same time, like you mentioned at the top of the program, we support reforms, pro-democracy reforms like fusion voting. We also promote the idea of multi-member districts and ranked choice voting. All of these reforms allow a very rigid, not really democratic system like the U.S. Two-party system. These reforms make it more democratic and make it more grassroots. Fusion allow for parties like ours to be able to cross-endorse during general elections. So what that means is we could choose to endorse another party's candidate. So I'll give an example. Joe Biden wasn't our first pick. We endorsed Elizabeth Warren, and then we endorsed Bernie Sanders. Eventually, when Joe Biden became the Democratic nominee in New York, where we have the fusion voting and we have a ballot line, we cross-endorsed the Democrat because we believed that Joe Biden was the better choice.
Okay.
In the head-to-head against Donald Trump.
Right. So basically, right.
Joe Biden, we're voting for a progressive agenda.
Right. Okay. So basically, your electoral strategy is mostly electoral fusion, where you support another party's candidate if you feel he or she aligns with your platform, but you don't particularly favor either the Democrats or the Republicans, because I read somewhere that you've also supported Republican candidates.
Well, we've existed for more than 20 years, and in the early days in New York when we existed, there were times where we endorsed, and that was like a different time, like politically, when we endorsed the Republican when that Republican was better than the other person on the ballot. Most of the people that we endorse tend to be Democrats, but again, we challenge this whole Democrat-Republican sort of dichotomy. And one of the things that we've recognized is having a D next to your name doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to advocate for people. right? This is why third party and minor party expression is so critical in the context of the United States, especially when you look at how tribal and how deeply oppositional our politics have become, where we have working people pitted against each other because the two schemes of the two parties are pitting people against one another, when the true struggle should be working people trying to figure out how we could bring our power together in order to make sure that the corporate agenda doesn't succeed. And
But the problem, of course, Maurice, sorry to interrupt you, but the problem is that your party is just too small to make a significant difference. I mean, the dominant parties are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And you may be, to some extent, you may have some influence, perhaps on the council level and maybe even up to the congressional level or whatever, but it's a very minuscule influence. So you're not really making a dent, are you?
Well, I beg to differ. Over the past 20 years, we've recruited people who have gone, for example, look at the New York gubernatorial. I think you would agree that a governor of a state is a pretty high position. In the current gubernatorial race, there are two people who are real contenders, Jumaane Williams and Tish James, who came through the Working Families Party. Tish James is the Attorney General of New York. She came through the Working Families Party. We've recruited people over years that are playing major roles. In Congress, we have a number of folks who are working families Democrats who this legislative session fought gallantly in order to ensure that the large infrastructure package was able to go through.
Okay, I'll tell you what, stay with us, Maurice. We're going to come back and continue this conversation, but I got to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party, one of the smaller political parties that's gradually growing in influence in the US. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now, they call them the spoilers and invigorators of American politics, those minor political parties that hang around the corners of the electoral process. You've probably heard of the Democrats and the Republicans, but have you heard of the lesser-known parties such as the Working Families Party? Well, the WFP is one of the relative newcomers to American politics who try and sometimes succeed in shaking up the national political order using a system known as fusion voting to influence election results and policy. So how does this work and how effective is it? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, here's Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party, speaking about why he joined a minor rather than a major party in America.
Act of resiliency. It is an act of resistance because we will get our demand.
So when I was growing up, my parents didn't vote, actually. Now, it wasn't because they didn't care or didn't want to. They read the papers. They had deeply held views that they passed on to me. They were active in the community and in their unions. They didn't vote because they couldn't. They were immigrants with green cards. And I, as the youngest child of immigrants, was the first voter in my family. It wasn't until years after I started voting at 18 that my parents became citizens and got the right to vote. Now, what I want to tell you is about how much they love to vote, how much they delight in it, how much they revel in it. They're in their 70s now, and they still wake up very, very early, like 6:30 at the crack of dawn to vote on election day. In fact, my mother now volunteers as a poll watcher. And they have this excitement like kids on Christmas morning around voting, and they vote in every single election. Because when you don't have something so vital, that's when you know how deeply you need it. That's how you really truly value something often, when you don't have it, when it's beyond your reach.
Well, for more on the smaller parties in America and why they're important, I'm joined on the line from New York by Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. He's been with us, of course, on the program, and he's still with us. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. I was hoping you'd tell us why, because you seem very politically active and very politically clued on. why you prefer to go with such a small party rather than rising up the ranks as one of the sort of budding stars of the Democratic Party.
Well, based on my assessment, and I've been organizing for years, that the current two-party system, which includes the Democrats and the Republicans, is a duopoly. And the possibility for change in that two-party duopoly is relatively limited. And if you want to manifest transformative change, you have to engage in strategies outside of the current systems. And that's what brought me to that's how I reasoned that being part of the Working Families Party, joining the Working Families Party, and now leading the Working Families Party was the best strategy for my politics, and the best strategy to make the most change. So, before the break, you talked about the fact that we're small relative to the two sort of traditional parties. Well, I'd like to hearken you back to just a few years ago when Barack Obama was president. There was this right-wing conservative formation called the Tea Party. And the Tea Party was relatively small. The Tea Party movement was relatively small as it related to the Republican and the Democratic Party. But it had an oversized influence on our politics that we live in today. We are living in the politics shaped by the Tea Party movement, right? They were small, but they were clear and they had a very clear intervention. And they were sitting outside in some ways, in some respects, of the two parties, but also influencing the Republican Party, and not just influencing the Republican Party, moving our entire politics further to the right. We seek to do that, and I seek to do that. But instead of moving the politics to the right, we seek to move the politics closer to the people.
Right, that's interesting. Nevertheless, the Working Families Party is still a political party, and therefore we have to use the yardsticks for judging a political party to assess the WFP. I mean, what's the electoral track record of the Working Families Party across the US? I mean, how many people voted for your party in the last election in the US, for instance?
So we have millions of voters all across the country. We've just to use New York as example, right? In New York, the Working Families Party is behind the Democrats and Republicans, the third largest vote getter in New York State politics. And in race after race after race, our candidates are running and winning. I like to say that we are a non-delusional third-party political formation. We care deeply about victory, and not just in places like New York, where there's a lot of progressive people, but in places like West Virginia, in places like Texas, in places like Colorado, in places like Wisconsin. We're winning, and we're winning races that a lot of folks say we shouldn't win on the city council level, on the school board level, on the mayoral level. Just a few days ago in Atlanta, we had an upset in the Atlanta city council. There's two working families, deeply committed working families champions who are now on the Atlanta City Council.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Sorry to interrupt you again, Maurice, but that's what I was going to ask you, because I know that you use this cross-endorsement strategy and this electoral fusion to kind of move by proxy your policies and your ideology. But I'm curious to know how much you sometimes put forward your own candidates, and if so, is that at the, council level, or does it go beyond that?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm talking about. So the fusion stuff, that happens in some states where that's the state law. So in New York and Connecticut, we rely on fusion. We also recruit our own candidates. In the case of the Atlanta City Council, those are Working Families Democrats that we endorsed that are going to be caucusing with us and a coalition of folks in order to advance our agenda, right? These are not people that folks in the traditional Democratic Party structure are supporting. These are insurgents that are challenging the status quo, right? And some of which we're actually endorsing and supporting, and we are surrounding. So we are coordinating with them and helping them win with our volunteer power, with our texting and phone banking and knocking on doors. We're doing independent campaigns where we're putting up television ads and sending mail for them.
Right,
It's
but I
really,
mean, sorry to
it's
interrupt
really
you
a
again,
plan.
Maurice. Wouldn't you, I mean, just listening to you talking, and you're clearly very articulate because, I mean, you're making a lot of sense, but wouldn't you be more effective as a pressure or lobby group rather than a political party? Because that sounds like that's a lot of what you're doing.
Well, our main intervention, the tip of the spear intervention for us is elections. Because one of the things that we've recognized is that when you're able to use the carrot and stick of elections, when you're actually able to unelect people through primaries, when you're able to disrupt the status quo by removing incumbents that have been there for decades, that's when you're able to dramatically move your agenda. When you're only operating as a advocacy group on the outside petitioning politicians, then you're only using one tool. We support that, and we have a lot of groups that are part of our coalition that do that. But when your people are actually the actual decision makers, then you're able to have this inside outside power that accelerates your agenda. That's something that we found. That's why we're building a political party. But we also agree that there's different types of power. There's
Right.
protest. There's labor power and the ability
Okay.
for unions to organize worker power. There's the advocacy and work that you talked about.
Right. Well,
All
Maurice, what you're saying is very interesting indeed, and it's really nice talking with you. And when there's another American election, come and talk to us. Maurice Mitchell is the National Director of the Working Families Party, and he was talking to me from New York.